Before we begin tonight, close your eyes for just a moment. Imagine a garden, not a large garden, a small one, perhaps 10 meters across, enclosed by old stone walls softened with moss. Inside it, raked white gravel surrounds 15 stones arranged in a pattern that has no obvious symmetry and yet feels, somehow, completely resolved. A single pine tree grows at one edge, its branches reaching outward with the deliberate patience of something that has been growing in exactly this direction for 200 years. It is early morning. The light is the particular grey gold of a Japanese dawn, soft, diffused, arriving without announcement. Somewhere beyond the garden walls, a temple bell sounds. Once, then silence, and once more. A figure sits at the edge of the garden, a man in dark robes perfectly still, watching the raked gravel the way you watch water, not looking for anything, not waiting for anything, simply present. He's been sitting here since before the light came. He will still be sitting here when the light goes. Tonight we are going to Japan. Not the Japan of bullet trains and neon-lit cities, though that Japan is extraordinary too. The Japan of 1,000 years of extraordinary history. The Japan of samurai and Zen masters and geisha and poets who walked alone through the mountains writing the most compressed and beautiful verses ever set down in any language. The Japan of ink ground slowly on stone, of silk dyed the color of autumn, of swords made with such care they were considered living things, of gardens designed to contain the entire universe in the space of a few carefully placed stones. A civilization that understood perhaps better than any other that beauty was not decoration. It was philosophy. It was how you lived. Come with me. Welcome to Dreamy Night Facts, the gentle learning channel. This is your quiet place, a space set apart from the noise and movement of the day, designed only for rest, for stillness, for the soft drift toward sleep. Tonight, we are traveling a very long way, through time as much as distance, to a civilization that built an entire way of life around the pursuit of beauty, stillness, and the art of being fully present in each passing moment. If you enjoy tonight's journey, please consider giving it a like. It helps more people find their way here. And if this kind of gentle content is what you need at the end of the day, subscribe and ring the bell. New sleep stories arrive regularly whenever you need them. Now, let everything else go. Japan is waiting. Before we begin to travel, let us simply be still for a moment. Let your body settle wherever it is resting. Feel the weight of it, the heaviness of your limbs, the soft pressure of the surface beneath you. There is nothing you need to adjust, nothing you need to fix. You are already exactly where you need to be. Take a slow breath in. Feel your chest and your belly rise gently with it. And breathe out slowly, letting the breath leave in its own time. Not pushed, not hurried, just released. Again, in, filling yourself gently, the way a bowl fills with still water, from the bottom upward, gradually, without rushing. And out, the tension in your shoulders softening, your jaw loosening, the muscles around your eyes releasing. Once more, in and out. Good. With each breath now, let the weight of the day begin to settle downward, like sediment drifting slowly to the floor of a deep, clear lake. The thoughts, the plans, the small unfinished things, let them drift down gently out of reach. Not gone, just resting. You are safe here. You are warm. And in a few moments, you will be somewhere extraordinarily beautiful. Close your eyes now, if you haven't already, and let us begin. The island at the edge of the world. Japan is a country made of islands. 4 main islands and nearly 7,000 smaller ones, stretching in a long curving arc along the western edge of the Pacific Ocean, as though the land itself has turned slightly away from the continent behind it and chosen instead to face the open sea. The islands are mountainous, dramatic, the kind of geography that shapes the people who live within it in ways so fundamental they eventually stop noticing the shaping. 80% of Japan is mountain. Think about what that means for a civilization trying to build itself. There are no great flat plains for large-scale farming, no broad rivers navigable for long distances, no easy routes between one place and another. Every settlement, every town, every village must find its own relationship with the mountains and the valleys and the sea, must develop its own particular way of surviving, its own local deity, its own festival, its own relationship to the land. This is one reason Japan became so extraordinarily diverse in its local cultures, and one reason it became so extraordinarily unified in its national ones. The sea was everywhere. On clear days, from almost anywhere in Japan, you could see or smell it. The fishing villages, the tidal flats, the particular quality of the light on a coast that faces the vast open Pacific. These things became embedded in Japanese culture at the deepest level, shaping the food, the art, the religion, the aesthetics of a people who understood intuitively that they lived between 2 infinities, the mountains behind, the ocean before, and this narrow, extraordinary strip of civilization in between. The first people arrived in Japan at least 30,000 years ago, perhaps much earlier. They were hunters and gatherers who left behind, among other things, the Jomon pottery, some of the oldest fired clay vessels ever found anywhere on Earth. These early Japanese decorated their pots with rope-impressed patterns of extraordinary intricacy, as though beauty in the making of a functional object was not an optional extra, but simply the way things were done. This instinct, this insistence on making even useful things beautiful would persist in Japanese culture for the next 30 millennia without interruption. The landscape of Japan is itself a kind of art. Mount Fuji appearing above the clouds, cherry trees in full blossom along the banks of a river, autumn forests in the mountains. The Japanese call the turning of the autumn leaves momiji, and they have celebrated it for over 1,000 years with the same reverence Europeans reserved for religious festivals. Spring fog over rice paddies, the specific quality of light on a winter morning when snow has fallen on a temple roof. Nature in Japan was never simply background. It was the primary subject. Everything else, the art, the religion, the architecture, the philosophy, was, at some fundamental level, an attempt to understand and respond to the extraordinary natural world that surrounded these islands on all sides, and the seasons. The Japanese relationship with the four seasons is unlike any other culture's. Each season was not simply a change in weather, but a complete change in aesthetic atmosphere, in emotional register, in the appropriate colors to wear, and the appropriate food to eat, and the appropriate poetry to write. The cherry blossom of spring, the cicadas of summer, the crimson leaves of autumn, the silence of snow, each one a separate universe, each one demanding its own response. To be Japanese, at some level, was to be always in conversation with the season you were in, and always aware that it was passing. The age of the gods, Shinto, before Buddhism arrived in Japan, before writing, before the formal structures of government and court, there was Shinto. Shinto is not quite a religion in the way that word is usually understood. It has no founder, no sacred scripture, no set of commandments to be followed. It is something older and stranger than that, a way of perceiving the world that grew directly from the landscape of Japan itself, from the specific quality of being alive on these particular islands in this particular light. The central idea of Shinto is simple, and when you sit with it long enough, quietly astonishing. Everything has a spirit, not just animals, though animals certainly had spirits. Mountains, rivers, stones, trees, waterfalls, the wind, the rice that grew in the paddy fields, the thread that a weaver passed through a loom, the specific patch of forest where the light fell differently in the late afternoon. All of these things were alive in a way that went beyond the merely physical. All of them contained kami, spirit, presence, a living quality that demanded respect and acknowledgement. There are said to be 8 million kami in Japan, 8 million distinct spirits inhabiting the natural world, each one with its own character, its own preferences, its own moods. The great mountain kami who needed to be approached with ceremony, the small household kami who kept the hearth warm and the rice from spoiling, the kami of the crossroads who could either protect or mislead a traveler. The kami of the sea, who decided whether the fishing boats came home. This was not a primitive worldview. It was an extraordinarily sophisticated one. A civilization that believed everything had a spirit was a civilization that could not easily justify treating the natural world carelessly. If the river had a spirit, you could not simply pollute it. If the ancient tree had a spirit, you did not cut it down without ceremony, without acknowledgement, without apology. If the stone in the mountain path had a spirit, you noticed it, you paid attention. Shinto produced a people who were extraordinarily attentive, who looked very carefully at the world around them and saw everywhere the presence of something that merited care. The great Shinto shrines of Japan, Ise, Fushimi Inari, Izumo, are among the most atmospherically powerful places on earth, not because they are large or lavishly decorated. Many of them are quite simple, built of unpainted wood, deliberately unornate, but because of what surrounds them. The ancient cedar forests, the stone lanterns half covered in moss, the long paths of approach that slow the walker down, that move them through increasingly quiet and increasingly sacred space. The approach to a Shinto shrine is designed to gradually separate you from the ordinary world. Each torii gate you pass through marks another degree of transition. The noise of daily life falls away. The air smells different. Cedar and incense and the particular mineral smell of old stone. Your footsteps slow without your deciding to slow them. By the time you reach the inner sanctuary, you have been walking through sacred space long enough that the boundary between the everyday and the divine has become, somehow, negotiable. You have arrived somewhere that has been considered holy for 1,000 years, and the land itself seems to know it. Japanese mythology was full of these encodings, stories that entertained and also taught, that populated the unknown edges of the world, and also carried, in their structure, genuine wisdom about how to move through it safely. The Yuki-onna, the snow woman, appeared in blizzards and mountain passes, a figure of extraordinary beauty dressed entirely in white, her skin as pale as the snow around her, her breath visible in the freezing air. She brought death to travelers lost in the storm, drawing them toward her with her beauty until the cold took them. But in some versions of the story, she was also capable of mercy, sparing the young, the innocent, those whose beauty or purity moved something in her that she herself didn't fully understand. She was winter itself, beautiful, deadly, and occasionally inexplicably kind. The great festivals of the Japanese calendar were anchored in this spirit world. Obon, the festival of the dead, held in mid-August, was the time when the spirits of the ancestors returned to visit the living. Families cleaned and decorated the grave sites. They lit lanterns to guide the spirits home. They danced the Bon Odori, a circular dance performed outdoors in the summer evening. its movements the same movements that had been performed for centuries, the music the same music that the ancestors had danced to when they were alive. At the end of Obon, small paper lanterns were floated on rivers and lakes and the sea, Toro Nagashi, the floating lanterns, to guide the spirits back to the world they had come from. Watching the lanterns drift away on dark water, their small flames reflected below them, was one of the most beautiful and most quietly melancholy sights in the Japanese calendar. The boundary between the living and the dead, like the boundary between the human world and the spirit world, was understood to be real but permeable. The dead were not gone. They were simply elsewhere. And once a year, in the warm nights of August, with lantern light on the water and the sound of drums and the smell of summer, they came home. Oni, Kitsune, and the spirit world. Japan has one of the richest and strangest mythological imaginations in the world. Not strange in the sense of primitive or unsophisticated, but strange in the way that all genuine mythology is strange, which is to say, arising from the deepest and most honest part of the human imagination, the part that knows the world is larger and more mysterious than any single explanation can contain, and that populates the unmapped edges of that mystery with figures that are not quite human and not quite divine, but something more interesting than either. The spirit world of Japan was not separate from the everyday world. It was adjacent to it. It occupied the same forests, the same mountain passes, the same lonely crossroads and abandoned houses. It moved through the same seasons. It was made visible in the same weather. The particular quality of mist on a mountainside, the sudden stillness before a storm, the light in a forest at dusk when the shadows shifted in ways that had no obvious cause. The Japanese understood that the boundary between the human world and the spirit world was a permeable one, and they populated the other side with extraordinary beings. The Oni were the most feared. They were enormous, taller than any human, massively built, their bodies red or blue or green, their faces twisted into expressions of permanent ferocity. They carried great iron clubs called kanabo, and they were associated with illness, disaster, and the punishment of human wickedness. In the Buddhist cosmology that gradually merged with Shinto, the Oni became the torturers of the damned, the beings who carried out the sentences of the underworld with thorough and impersonal efficiency. But the Oni were not simply evil. They were forces of nature, powerful, dangerous, but also, in some traditions, capable of being appeased, redirected, even befriended. The bean-throwing ceremony of Setsubun, still practiced throughout Japan today, drove away the Oni of the old year with shouts of Oni wa Soto, Fuku wa Uchi, demons out, good fortune in. The Oni were real enough to require this annual banishment, but manageable enough that a handful of dried beans could accomplish it. In some stories, the Onai were almost sympathetic, lonely beings living in the mountains, misunderstood and feared, occasionally finding an unexpected connection with the humans, brave enough to look past their terrifying appearance. The Kitsune, the fox spirit, was something else entirely. The fox in Japanese mythology was a creature of intelligence, mystery, and extraordinary magical ability. A kitsune could take human form, and did so frequently, usually as a beautiful woman, though sometimes as an old man or a traveler. They were associated with the god Inari, the deity of rice, agriculture, and industry, and the thousands of Inari shrines scattered across Japan were guarded by pairs of stone foxes sitting on either side of the torii gate. Kitsune accumulated power and magical ability with age. A young fox had one tail. As centuries passed and the fox grew in wisdom and power, it accumulated more tails, up to 9, each one representing 100 years of life and a corresponding increase in supernatural ability. A 9-tailed fox was an ancient and supremely powerful being, capable of almost any transformation, wise beyond human comprehension, and deeply ambiguous in its relationship to humanity. Kitsune could be benevolent, protecting families, bringing good fortune, serving as messengers of the gods. They could also be mischievous, leading travelers astray, creating illusions so convincing that the person deceived might spend years living in what they believed was their ordinary life before the fox chose to reveal that none of it had been real. The kitsune's great vulnerability was its tail. A fox in human form could maintain the transformation perfectly in most circumstances, but a reflection in water or an unguarded moment near a fire might reveal the tail that couldn't quite be hidden. This was how the clever human in the story always discovered the truth, by noticing what the fox forgot to conceal. The tanuki, the raccoon dog, was rounder and more cheerful than the fox. Its mythology shot through with humor rather than mystery. Tanuki were shapeshifters of considerable ability but limited wisdom, whose magical transformations often went comically wrong. They were associated with good fortune, generosity, and the kind of warm, uncomplicated happiness that arrived unexpectedly and left you feeling slightly better about the world. Ceramic tanuki statues, round-bellied, wide-hatted, carrying a flask of sake, stood outside restaurants and shops throughout Japan as symbols of welcome and good luck. Where the kitsune was elegant and dangerous, the tanuki was warm and bumbling. Both were necessary. A mythology needed its foxes and its raccoon dogs, its mysteries and its jokes. The Tengu were among the most fascinating figures in the Japanese spirit world, part human and part bird, sometimes depicted with wings and beaks, sometimes with an enormously elongated human nose that suggested the beak had been softened into something almost human. The Tengu inhabited the mountain forests and were associated with martial arts, pride, and the particular dangers of spiritual arrogance. They were said to be the teachers of the greatest samurai swordsmanship. The legendary swordsman Minamoto no Yoshitsune was said to have received his training from a Tengu in the forests of Kurama Mountain, learning the sword arts not from any human master, but from a being of the spirit world whose speed and skill went beyond anything human training could produce. This origin story told something important about how the Japanese understood the greatest martial arts. They came not merely from technique, but from something more mysterious, something that connected the warrior to the deeper forces of the world. The Tengu were also cautionary figures. They were said to prey specifically on Buddhist monks who had become too proud of their spiritual achievements, swooping down to confuse and humble those who believed themselves to have attained more than they had. The message was consistent with Zen philosophy. The moment you believed you had arrived, you had lost the way. The Kappa were water creatures, small, humanoid, their heads bearing a dish filled with water that was the source of their supernatural power. They inhabited rivers, lakes, and ponds, and they were associated with the particular dangers of water, the sudden depth, the unexpected current, the way that water that appeared shallow could swallow a person without warning. Parents warned children about Kappa the way parents everywhere warn children about water, through stories vivid enough to be remembered. But Kappa could also be negotiated with. They were, despite their danger, bound by a formal politeness that could be turned against them. If you bowed deeply to a Kappa, it would bow in return, and in bowing it would spill the water from its head dish, losing its power. This was not just a clever story. It was an encoding in mythological form of a genuine social value, that courtesy was a form of power, that the person who maintained their manners in a dangerous situation had an advantage over the one who didn't. The imperial court at Kyoto, the Heian period. In the year 794, the Emperor of Japan moved his capital to a city that would become known as Kyoto. He would have no way of knowing that this city would remain the imperial capital for over 1,000 years, or that the period beginning with this move would eventually be looked back upon as perhaps the most aesthetically extraordinary era in the history of human civilization. The Heian period lasted from 794 to 1185. For almost 400 years, the imperial court at Kyoto developed a culture of such refined beauty, such minute attention to aesthetic detail, such extraordinary creative productivity, that it stands apart from almost anything else in recorded history. The court was small, perhaps 10,000 people at its height. Nobles, court ladies, priests, poets, musicians, servants, living within a compound of extraordinary elegance in a city laid out on a perfect grid, its streets named for flowers and seasons, what they created within this enclosed world was remarkable. The nobles of the Heian court understood themselves to be participants in an ongoing aesthetic project. Every aspect of life was a form of art, the choice of which layered silk robes to wear, and the combinations of color visible at the cuffs and collar were as considered and as communicative as any painting. The correct response to a falling autumn leaf, the precise emotional register of a poem sent at dawn to a person whose window you had noticed was lit past midnight. Yes, poems were the primary form of communication for important matters. A Heian nobleman did not write a formal letter. He wrote a poem. If he wished to express admiration, he sent a poem. If he wished to apologize, he sent a poem. If he wished to arrange a meeting, comment on the weather, acknowledge a gift, or express grief at a death, he sent a poem. And the poem was judged not only on its content, but on the quality of the calligraphy, the color of the paper, the choice of ink, and whether a spray of the right seasonal flower had been attached to the scroll. A slow or clumsy poem could damage a reputation. A truly beautiful one could make a career. This was a world in which aesthetic sensitivity was not a hobby, but a social skill of the highest order. A person who could not compose a poem with grace, who could not appreciate the precise emotional resonance of the correct seasonal reference, who chose colors that clashed or paper that was inappropriate to the occasion, such a person was simply not fully civilized. And in this world, women were among the greatest artists. The women of the Heian court wrote some of the most extraordinary literature ever produced. Murasaki Shikibu wrote The Tale of Genji, a work generally considered the world's first novel, and one of its greatest in the early 11th century. A woman, writing in the year 1000, produced a psychologically sophisticated, emotionally complex, beautifully written account of court life and human love that would not be matched for centuries. Seishonagon wrote The Pillow Book, a collection of observations, lists, musings, and descriptions so precise and so vivid that reading it feels less like reading ancient literature and more like reading the private notebook of someone who has just stepped out of the room. Her list of things that make the heart beat faster includes sparrows feeding their young, passing a place where incense has been burned, a night with a clear moon, and finding in a novel you've been given a passage that exactly describes your own experience. 1100 years later, this list still works. Poetry, haiku, and the art of saying everything in nothing. Of all the extraordinary things Japan gave the world, perhaps none is more quietly astonishing than haiku. Haiku is a form of poetry so compressed, so disciplined, so demanding in its apparent simplicity, that it has occupied serious poets for 5 centuries and still has not been exhausted. A haiku is 17 syllables long, 3 lines, 5 syllables, then 7. then 5 again. That is the entire formal requirement. Within that small space, within those 17 syllables, a haiku must do something very specific. It must capture a single moment in the natural world with such precision and such presence that the reader experiences not a description of the moment, but the moment itself, not thought about, not remembered, experienced. The master of haiku was Matsuo Basho, who lived in 17th century Japan and is still considered one of the greatest poets who ever lived in any language. Basho spent much of his life walking. He would set out from his small hut. He deliberately lived simply, almost austerely, in order to remain sensitive to experience, and walk through the Japanese countryside for months at a time alone, through all weathers, observing the world with a quality of attention so refined and so patient that he could find in a single frog jumping into a pond an entire meditation on the nature of presence and absence, sound and silence, time and eternity. An old, silent pond. A frog jumps into the pond, splash. Silence again. This is possibly the most famous poem in the Japanese language, and it is also in 17 syllables, one of the most philosophically complete poems in the world. The silence before, the sudden presence of sound, the silence after, and between them, the flash of something alive, something in motion, something that briefly made the silence audible by interrupting it. Basho did not write this poem at a desk. He wrote it beside the pond. This was the principle. Poetry was not made at a remove from experience. It was made in the middle of it, at the moment of encounter between the human consciousness and the natural world, when both were fully present to each other. Other Japanese poetic forms extended this principle. Tanka, the 31-syllable poem that had been practiced since the Heian court. Renga, linked verse, where poets would build a poem together, each adding a stanza, creating something collaborative and cumulative. Kigo, the seasonal reference required in every haiku, the word or image that placed the poem in a specific time of year, that connected the single moment to the turning of the entire year. Japanese poetry was always aware of the season it was in, always aware of what was passing. This awareness, this quality of attention to impermanence, ran through every aspect of Japanese culture, like a thread woven into every piece of fabric. You could feel it in the poems, in the tea ceremony, in the design of the gardens, in the precise and deliberate way a geisha moved across a room. Nothing lasted forever, and that was not cause for despair. It was the source of beauty, the rise of the samurai. For the first several centuries of Japanese recorded history, power resided with the emperor and the noble families of the imperial court. The emperor was considered divine, a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. and the business of governance was conducted through poetry and ceremony and the elaborate protocols of court life. War, when it occurred, was conducted by professional fighting men hired by the noble families. These men were called bushi, or warriors. Over time, as the central power of the court weakened and regional lords began competing for land and influence, the warrior class grew in importance until it eclipsed the court entirely. By the 12th century, Japan was governed not by emperors and court nobles but by military commanders. The first shogun, Minamoto no Yoritomo, established a military government in 1185 that would be the effective power in Japan for the next 7 centuries, and the samurai became the defining figure of Japanese civilization. The word samurai means literally one who serves. The samurai was a warrior in service to a lord, sworn to loyalty, trained from childhood in the arts of combat, governed by a strict code of honor and conduct that shaped every aspect of his life. Not just how he fought, but how he ate, how he dressed, how he spoke, how he died. The samurai were not simply soldiers. They were, at their best, something more complex and more interesting than that. They were expected to be educated as well as lethal, to compose poetry as well as wield a sword, to appreciate the tea ceremony as well as the battle formation, to face death with as much equanimity as they faced life. The great samurai clans, the Minamoto, the Taira, the Tokugawa, shaped Japanese history through centuries of war, alliance, betrayal, and extraordinary individual courage. The battles between them were the subject of the great military epics, the Gunki Mono, that sit alongside Homer and the Norse sagas as some of the most extraordinary war literature ever written. But it is the philosophy of the samurai, more than the battles, that has traveled furthest through time. Bushido, the way of the warrior. The samurai women honor Geisha. When most people imagine a samurai, they imagine a man. History is more interesting than that. The honor Geisha, the female warrior, was a recognized tradition in Japanese martial culture, stretching back at least to the 3rd century, when the warrior queen Tomoe Gozen became one of the most celebrated fighters in Japanese history. Women of the samurai class were trained in weapons and combat not as a curiosity or an exception, but as a practical and honored tradition. The primary weapon of the Onna Geisha was the naginata, a long curved blade mounted on a wooden shaft, somewhere between a spear and a sword in its reach and movement. The naginata was considered ideally suited to a female fighter because its length allowed the use of leverage and reach rather than brute strength, and because a woman defending a household against multiple attackers needed a weapon that could be used in a wide, sweeping arc, keeping opponents at distance. Female samurai were trained in this weapon from girlhood. They were also trained in tantojutsu, the art of the short blade, and in the practical strategies of defensive warfare, because the honor Geisha's most important role was often the defense of the castle or the home when the male samurai were away at war. A woman, alone with children and servants, facing an enemy force that had breached the outer walls, needed to be a capable, trained, psychologically prepared fighter. Archaeological evidence has borne this out in ways that surprised even historians. DNA analysis of remains from major samurai battle sites has revealed that a significant proportion of the warriors buried there were female. They fought, they died in battle, and for centuries history recorded them simply as samurai. Tomoe Gozen, who fought in the Genpei War of the late 12th century, was described in the military epic Heike Monogatari as remarkably strong and brave, a warrior worth 1,000, ready to confront a demon or a god mounted or on foot. She was a master of both the sword and the bow, and her fame spread across Japan as a symbol not of the exception but of the possibility. These women embodied the same code as their male counterparts, the same loyalty, the same discipline, the same readiness, the same willingness, when honor demanded it, to face whatever came without flinching. Sumo, the sacred contest. Before, it was a sport. Sumo was a prayer. This is the thing that most people who have never looked closely at sumo do not know. And it is the thing that makes sumo unlike any other form of combat in the world. At its deepest level, beneath the spectacle, beneath the power, beneath the extraordinary physicality of two enormous men colliding in a space barely larger than a dining room, sumo was, and in its most traditional form still is, a ritual act, a conversation between the human world and the divine one, an offering. The origins of sumo reach back at least 2,000 years, and possibly much further. The earliest written records, the Kojiki, the record of ancient matters compiled in 712, describe sumo as a contest performed in the presence of the gods. In the mythology, the very possession of the Japanese islands was decided by a sumo match between two deities. Takemikazuchi, the god of thunder, and Takeminakata, a rival god, wrestled for sovereignty, and the outcome determined which divine lineage would govern the land. Sumo, in other words, began at the moment of creation. In the early centuries of Japanese history, sumo was performed as part of Shinto harvest festivals, a ritual offering to the kami, a demonstration of human strength and dedication made in hopes of a good harvest, protection from disaster, and divine favor. The matches were held in shrine precincts before the gods, and the outcome was understood as a reflection of divine will rather than simply human ability. The wrestling ring itself, the dohyo, was sacred space. The circular ring of packed clay and rice straw bales, perhaps 4.5 meters across, was not merely a playing surface. It was a ritual space, prepared with ceremony and consecrated before each tournament. Salt was thrown into the ring before each match, a Shinto purification practice, the salt driving away impurity and evil spirits, making the space appropriate for the sacred contest that was about to take place. This practice of throwing salt continues in professional sumo today. Every time a professional sumo wrestler throws a handful of salt into the ring before his match, a gesture that most Western observers interpret as theatrical or superstitious, he is performing an act of Shinto purification that connects him directly to wrestlers who have performed the same gesture in the same spirit for 2,000 years. The wrestlers themselves, rikishi, a word that means literally powerful warrior, were understood in the early tradition as intermediaries of a kind. Their contest was not merely between themselves, but between the forces they represented, and their preparation for competition was as much spiritual as physical. The dohyo iri, the ring entering ceremony, still performed before major tournaments today, is the clearest survival of this ancient spiritual dimension. The yokozuna, the grand champion, the highest rank in sumo, a rank so rare and so demanding that only a handful of wrestlers in each generation ever achieve it, performs a ceremony of extraordinary deliberateness and beauty before each tournament. Dressed in his white hemp rope belt, the yokozuna rope, from which the rank takes its name, and his paper streamers, he enters the ring and performs a sequence of movements, the deep stamps, the wide arm gestures, the sustained positions of absolute stillness. These movements are identical to the movements performed by Shinto priests in purification ceremonies. They are not derived from them. They are them. The yokozuna, standing in the ring with his arms spread wide and his feet stamping the ground, is simultaneously a wrestler preparing for competition and a priest purifying sacred space. Both things are completely true. Both things have always been completely true. The physical practice of sumo was already well established by the Nara period, the 8th century, when the imperial court formalized it as an official court event. Sumi-e no Seichie, the wrestling festival, was held annually before the emperor, with wrestlers gathered from all over Japan to compete in a tournament that combined athletic competition with elaborate ritual. The best wrestlers received imperial gifts and imperial favor. This connection to imperial patronage shaped sumo's development profoundly. Unlike other martial arts which developed primarily in the context of military training and samurai culture, sumo retained its direct connection to the imperial court and to Shinto practice throughout the centuries of its development. When the samurai period brought changes to almost every other aspect of Japanese culture, sumo continued its ancient relationship with the gods and the emperor largely unchanged. The wrestlers of the Edo period, the era from which modern professional sumo most directly descends, were celebrated figures in the popular culture of the floating world. Woodblock prints showed the great champions in dramatic poses, their enormous bodies rendered with the same care and the same eye for dynamic composition that the print artists brought to depictions of actors and landscapes. The great Edo period champions were as famous in their time as any samurai commander or theatre actor. They were celebrated across the city, their victories discussed in tea houses and market stalls, their physiques admired, their personal lives the subject of endless popular fascination. But the physical reality of sumo training was far from glamorous. The life of a professional sumo wrestler was, and remains today, one of the most demanding existences in any sport. Young wrestlers, often recruited as teenagers from families who valued the tradition, entered Heia, the sumo stables where wrestlers lived and trained together under the authority of a stable master who was himself a former wrestler of high rank. The stable was not simply a training facility, it was a total environment, a world unto itself, with its own hierarchy, its own customs, its own rhythms, its own demands. The day began before dawn. Training, keiko, started in the early morning hours, before breakfast, when the body was empty and the mind was clear and nothing stood between the wrestler and the work. The training was relentless. The fundamental techniques practiced thousands of times, the same movements repeated until they were embedded in the muscles and the instincts, rather than merely understood by the conscious mind. The great techniques of sumo. There are over 80 recognized winning moves, each with its own ancient name, range from the obvious to the extraordinarily subtle. Yorikiri, the straightforward forcing out, pushing the opponent back and over the straw bale boundary of the ring with pure power and position. Oshidashi, the push out, driving the opponent backward with open palm thrust to the chest. Uwatenage, the overarm throw, using the opponent's own momentum and a grip on the belt to send him spinning to the clay. But also hatakikomi, the slap down, deflecting the opponent's charge with a sudden sideways movement that sends him crashing to the ground. Tsukiotoshi, the thrust down, a sudden change of direction that redirects the opponent's force into the earth. And kirikeishi, the twisting reversal, a technique of such subtlety and timing that it required years to develop and a fraction of a second to execute. Sumo was not simply about size. Size helped. It helped enormously, which was why the tradition of deliberate weight gain through disciplined eating became central to professional sumo training. The chanko nabe, the sumo hot pot, a nutritious stew of vegetables, meat, tofu, and whatever else the stable cook deemed appropriate, fed wrestlers in quantities designed to build the kind of mass that made a man very difficult to move. But the greatest wrestlers in sumo history were not always the largest. The Yokozuna Chiyono Fuji, known as the Wolf, one of the most celebrated grand champions of the 20th century, was considered small by the standards of professional sumo. He won over 1,000 professional matches and 31 tournament championships through technique, speed, intelligence, and a quality of physical conditioning that the heavier men around him could not match. He understood what all the great wrestlers understood, that sumo was not about overpowering an opponent. It was about reading an opponent, feeling through the grip and the contact and the shifting weight what the opponent was about to do, and responding to that intention before it became action. The greatest sumo was, like the greatest martial arts, a practice of anticipation and economy, of doing exactly what was necessary at exactly the right moment, with nothing wasted. The tachi-ai, the initial charge, was the moment everything compressed to a single point. Both wrestlers crouched at their starting marks, hands on the clay, eyes forward. The referee, the gyoji, dressed in the robes of a Heian period court official, carrying a fan of the same form used by court officials 12 centuries ago, raised his fan to signal readiness. The wrestlers studied each other. This moment of pre-contact stillness could last seconds or considerably longer, as each wrestler waited for the moment when he felt truly ready, not merely physically positioned but mentally present, his attention fully gathered, his intention clear. Then they exploded, from absolute stillness to absolute contact in a fraction of a second, two bodies colliding with a force that could be heard across the tournament hall. The sound of the tachi-ai, a physical impact as much as a sound, felt in the chest of the nearest spectators, and then the contest was decided in the space of a few seconds, or a few dozen seconds, through the application of technique and power and timing. One wrestler would cross the boundary of the ring or touch the clay with any part of his body other than his feet, and the match would be over. The winning wrestler rarely celebrated. The tradition demanded composure, the same quality of stillness after the match as before it. The winning wrestler returned to his position, accepted the referee's decision, and withdrew. The loser did the same. Both men bowed to the referee, to each other, to the ring. The ritual continued. This composure in victory, this refusal to display the emotion of winning, was not coldness or indifference. It was the expression of the same values that ran through everything in Japanese culture. The match was important. The outcome was important. But the manner of it was more important than either. How you won mattered more than that you won. How you lost mattered more than that you lost. The sumo ring, that circle of sacred clay no larger than a modest room, was a place where two extraordinary athletes met in a contest that had been performed in the same spirit, with the same ritual, before the same gods for 2,000 years. Every match was a link in a chain of unbroken practice reaching back to the moment when, according to the ancient records, the possession of the Japanese islands was decided by two gods wrestling in the first light of the world. The salt was thrown. The wrestlers crouched. The fan was raised. And the ancient contest continued. Bushido, the way of the warrior. Bushido was never written down as a formal code during the age of the samurai. It was lived. It was transmitted through example, through training, through the stories told about warriors who had embodied it most completely, and through the stories told with equal seriousness about those who had failed it. It was a code that existed in the muscles as much as the mind, absorbed through years of practice until it became not something a samurai followed, but something a samurai was. At its heart, Bushido rested on 7 virtues. Righteousness, Ji. The capacity to make the right decision even when the right decision was costly. A samurai who knew what was right and failed to act on it was not a samurai at all, but simply a man with a sword. Courage, you. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act rightly in the presence of it. Courage without righteousness was mere violence. Righteousness without courage was mere sentiment, benevolence, jin, compassion. The great samurai generals were expected to be fierce in battle and merciful in victory. Cruelty was weakness masquerading as strength. The truly powerful could afford to be kind. Respect, rei. Not the performance of politeness, but genuine regard for others. The elaborate rituals of Japanese courtesy, the specific angles of bowing, the precise forms of address, were the outward expression of an inward discipline that said, "This person before me matters." Honesty, Makoto. Truth in all things, including the things it was uncomfortable to be true about. A samurai's word was absolute. It required no contract, no witness, no verification. It was, by definition, true. Honor, meiyo. Not reputation, though reputation followed. Honor was the private standard against which every action was measured. A samurai alone in the dark with no witnesses was expected to behave exactly as he would in the full light of public scrutiny. And loyalty, chugi, the cornerstone of everything. The relationship between the samurai and his lord was the primary bond in the samurai's moral universe. It superseded personal comfort, personal safety, and in extreme cases, personal life. Death was not something Bushido feared. It was something Bushido prepared for. The samurai was expected to hold his own life lightly, not carelessly, but lightly. To be fully alive required being genuinely willing to die. A warrior who clung to life with desperation could not fight freely, could not decide clearly, could not serve his lord with the complete and unencumbered commitment that Bushido demanded. This acceptance of impermanence, this willingness to hold what you had without gripping it, connected Bushido at its deepest level to the same philosophy that ran through the haiku, through the tea ceremony, through the Japanese garden. Everything passes. Hold it fully. Let it go. The samurai sword, a living thing, The Japanese sword is the most technically accomplished edged weapon ever made by human hands. This is not national pride or cultural preference. It is the considered conclusion of metallurgists, weapons historians, and engineers who have studied the katana with the same rigor they would bring to any extraordinary piece of human ingenuity. What the Japanese swordsmiths achieved over centuries of accumulated knowledge, refinement, and absolute dedication to their craft was the solution to a problem that metallurgy had considered in various forms for as long as humans had been working metal. The problem was this: a sword needed to be two things simultaneously. It needed to be hard enough that its edge would hold, that it would cut cleanly and maintain that cutting ability through the use and abuse of battle. And it needed to be flexible enough that it would absorb the shock of impact, the clash of blade on blade without shattering. The problem was that hardness and flexibility were in steel opposing qualities. Hard steel was brittle. It would hold a magnificent edge but strike it sharply in the wrong direction, and it would snap. Flexible steel would bend and absorb shock beautifully, but it wouldn't hold an edge. The blade would fold rather than cut, and after a few uses would be dull and useless. Every sword-making tradition in the world faced this problem. Most solved it incompletely, accepting some compromise between hardness and flexibility, producing a weapon that was adequate but not exceptional. The Japanese swordsmith solved it completely. The raw material was tamahagane, jewel steel, produced by a smelting process unique to Japan. Iron sand, satetsu, was collected from rivers and mountain streams where the water had separated the iron-bearing sand from the lighter material around it. This sand was smelted in a clay furnace called a tatara. Over a period of 3 days and 3 nights, the bellows worked in continuous shifts by teams of men, the master swordsmith monitoring the temperature and the quality of the burn with a knowledge so intimate and so embodied that it could not be fully written down or fully taught, only transmitted by years of presence at the forge. The Tatra smelting process produced a bloom of steel of varying carbon content. The master swordsmith broke this bloom apart with a hammer and examined each piece, reading the crystalline structure of the broken edge with an expertise developed over decades. High carbon steel, which would become the hard outer shell of the sword. Low carbon steel, which would become the flexible inner core. These two steels would be worked separately, then combined. The high carbon steel was folded. This is the process most people have heard of, but its purpose and its sophistication are rarely fully explained. The steel was heated in the forge to a precise temperature, bright orange, almost yellow, the color that indicated exactly the right degree of plasticity, and hammered flat, then folded back on itself and hammered flat again, then heated and folded and hammered again. Each fold doubled the number of layers. After 10 folds, there were 1,024 layers. After 15 folds, there were 32,768. After 20 folds, though most swordsmiths stopped before this, knowing that too many folds could burn out the carbon and weaken the steel. There were over 1 million distinct layers of steel in a piece of metal smaller than a hand. What did this achieve? It distributed the carbon evenly throughout the steel, eliminating the inconsistencies and impurities of the original bloom and replacing them with a material of extraordinary homogeneity and quality. It also created a grain structure in the steel that was unlike anything produced by any other process, a complex, interlocking crystalline matrix of immense strength. The patterns of this grain, hada, were visible in the finished blade as a kind of texture on the polished surface, different for different swordsmiths and different forging techniques. The itama hada looked like wood grain. The masama hada produced straight parallel lines. The mukume hada created a pattern like the rings of a cross-section of wood. These patterns were as distinctive as a fingerprint, and expert sword scholars could identify the school, and sometimes the individual master from the header of the blade alone. The hard outer steel, hagane, was shaped into a U-shaped channel. The soft inner steel, shingane, was inserted into this channel. The two were forge-welded together, heated to the precise temperature at which the surfaces would bond without losing their separate identities, then hammered together with controlled force, the master reading the behavior of the metal under the hammer the way a musician read the behavior of an instrument under the bow. The composite blank was then shaped, hammered and ground into the profile of the sword, the blade tapering toward the point, the spine thickening toward the edge, the characteristic curve of the katana, sori, beginning to emerge from the straight blank as the differential cooling of the thicker spine and thinner edge caused the metal to bend. Then came the clay. The master swordsmith applied a mixture of clay, charcoal powder, and stone to the surface of the blade, thick along the spine, thin or absent along the cutting edge, and placed the prepared blade back in the forge. This was the most critical moment in the entire process. The blade was heated to the correct temperature, judged by color, in the specific darkness of the forge, against a reference point that existed only in the master's memory and experience, and then plunged into a trough of water, yaki-aya, the quench. The water contacted the clay-coated blade and the differential cooling began. The thin clay at the edge allowed the cutting steel to cool rapidly, transforming it into martensite, an extremely hard crystalline structure that would hold a razor edge. The thick clay along the spine slowed the cooling there, allowing the spine steel to remain softer and more flexible. The result was a blade that was hard where it needed to be hard and flexible where it needed to be flexible, the two properties existing simultaneously in the same piece of metal, each in its correct location. It was metallurgical genius, and visible on the surface of the finished blade at the boundary between the hard edge and the softer spine was the hamon, the temper line. The hamon was a wave-shaped line of crystalline activity, the visible record of the quench, the trace left by the meeting of the two different cooling rates. It ran along the length of the blade in patterns that were unique to each smith and each blade, near and neoi, the names given to the granular and misty qualities of the harmon's crystalline structure, could be read by experts the way the grain of the steel could be read. The harmon was not decoration, but it was extraordinarily beautiful. In certain lights, held at the specific angle to a source of illumination, the hamon appeared to shift and move, its crystalline structure catching and releasing the light with a quality that had no parallel in any other material. Sword connoisseurs would spend hours studying a single blade in the correct light, reading the hamon the way they might read a great poem. The grinding and polishing of the finished blade took longer than the forging. A master togishi, polisher, might spend weeks on a single sword, working through a progression of increasingly fine grinding stones until the surface of the blade achieved its final quality. The polish was not simply cosmetic. The final finish of the blade was a functional element, a mirror-polished surface cut more cleanly than a rough one. And the process of polishing also revealed the full beauty of the Haida and the harmon that the forging had created. The fitting of the sword, the handle, the guard, the scabbard, was the work of further specialist craftsmen, each one a master. The tsuba, the handguard, was a flat disc of iron or bronze positioned between the blade and the handle, protecting the hand from an opponent's blade sliding down toward the fingers. The tsuba was often a major work of decorative metalwork in its own right, carved and pierced in designs of extraordinary delicacy, showing landscapes, mythological creatures, natural forms, religious symbols. Some tsuba were valued as highly as the swords they protected. The handle, tsuba, was wrapped in ray skin for grip, then bound over this in a diamond pattern with silk cord, ito, in a wrapping called tsukamaki that was itself an art form. Its precise geometry achieved only by craftsmen who had practiced for years. The scabbard, saya, was carved from hinoki wood, lacquered and fitted so precisely to the blade that drawing the sword produced a characteristic sound, a soft, specific click as the blade separated from the scabbard's interior, a sound so distinctive and so associated with the weapon that it was described in literature and poetry as one of the most recognizable sounds of the samurai world. A completed sword of the highest quality took months to make. It was tested, traditionally on rolled straw, or, in earlier periods, on more grim materials, and a sword that passed its tests received a certificate from the master and was considered ready, but ready for more than battle. The samurai believed his sword was alive, not metaphorically, not poetically, literally alive, a living thing with a spirit, with tamashii, that had entered the blade in the process of its making and remained in it through the centuries of its existence. A sword that had been made well, that had been treated with respect, that had been used in service of righteous purposes. Such a sword accumulated a spiritual quality over time, became a repository of the honor and intention of all who had wielded it. This was why the sword was the most sacred object in the samurai's possession, why it was never left on the floor, why it was placed when the samurai entered a house in a specific location, pointed in a specific direction, why it was passed down through generations as the most important inheritance a samurai family could transmit. Not because it was a weapon, because it was a soul. The soul of the warrior who had made it. The soul of the swordsmith who had spent months bringing it into being. And the accumulated soul of every warrior who had carried it since. Every decision made with it, every battle fought, every life spared through mercy and every life ended through necessity, all of it present, all of it held in a piece of folded steel, no longer than a human arm, and as beautiful as anything Japan ever made. Samurai armor, the art of the warrior's body. A samurai preparing for battle began not with weapons, but with ceremony. The donning of armor was a ritual act, each piece put on in a specific order, with specific prayers and specific intentions, so that by the time the last element was in place, the warrior was not simply physically protected, but spiritually prepared. His mind settled into the particular quality of readiness that Bushido demanded. The armor itself was one of the most extraordinary objects ever made by human hands. Japanese armor, yoroi in its classical form, Tosei Gusoku in its later developments, was not a single piece but a complete system of interlocking components, each one the work of specialist craftsmen, each one a masterpiece in its own right. Begin with the foundation. Beneath the armor, the samurai wore a padded undergarment, shitage, that absorbed sweat and prevented the metal and leather from chafing. Over this went the coat, armored sleeves of chainmail and plate that protected the arms while allowing full movement. The sunade protected the shins, the hidate, a skirt of small armor plates, guarded the thighs, then the do, the cuirass, the body armor. Classical Japanese armor was not made of solid plate, as European armor often was. It was built from hundreds of small scales kozani of iron or hardened leather, each one individually crafted, individually lacquered in black or red or deep blue or gold, and then laced together with silk or leather cords in colors chosen with the same care that was given to the choice of kimono fabric. The lacquering served a double purpose. It protected the metal from rust, essential in the humid Japanese climate, and it allowed color, which transformed the armor from a purely functional object into a work of art. The great armors of the feudal period were objects of extraordinary beauty, their lacing in vivid silk creating patterns of color across the surface of the scales that caught the light as the warrior moved. Some armors used multiple colors of lacing that created deliberate gradations, dark at the top, lightening through the middle, pale at the hem, an aesthetic effect called ombre, though the Japanese had been doing it centuries before the word existed in French. The shoulder guards, or sode, were large, box-shaped, and hung from the shoulders with elaborate fastenings. They were designed to protect the upper arms from sword cuts and arrows, while also creating the distinctive, broad-shouldered silhouette that made the armored samurai so immediately recognizable and so visually imposing. Then the helmet. The kabuto was the most artistically elaborate element of the armor, and the one that communicated most directly the identity and status of the warrior who wore it. The bowl of the helmet, hachi, was constructed from multiple plates of iron riveted together, its surface sometimes smooth, sometimes decorated with raised ridges that followed the line of the plates, sometimes lacquered in vivid colors. Around its base hung the shikoro, a multi-layered curtain of lace scales that protected the neck and the lower face from sword cuts approaching from the sides and behind. But it was the maidate, the front crest, that made each helmet unique. The crests of samurai helmets were among the most extraordinary works of decorative metalwork ever made. Some were simple and powerful, a crescent moon in gold, horns of polished buffalo horn, a sun disk in gleaming brass. Others were fantastically elaborate, complete figures of dragons or phoenixes, the masks of gods, spreading wings of gilded copper that transform the warrior's silhouette into something more than human. The great commander Uesugi Kenshin wore a helmet crested with a Buddhist deity. Takeda Shingen bore the character for Fu, wind, on his battle standard, and a fearsome crest on his helmet that was recognized across every battlefield in Japan. Honda Tadakatsu, considered by many the greatest samurai warrior in Japanese history, wore a helmet decorated with enormous deer antlers and is said to have fought in over 100 battles without receiving a single serious wound. The face. Classical Japanese armor included a face mask, menpo, of iron and lacquer that covered some or all of the face. These masks were not blank. They were faces, fierce, expressive, deliberately terrifying, scowling demons, snarling warriors, faces contorted into expressions of such ferocity that enemies meeting the samurai's charge faced not a human being, but something that appeared to have stepped directly from the nightmare world of the Oni. The masks had a practical feature that was also, in its way, a work of psychological genius. They incorporated hooks, fukigeshi, at the corners of the mouth. These hooks held the mask slightly away from the face, allowing the samurai to shout, to breathe heavily in combat, to give orders to his troops. The hook also allowed the sweat of combat to drain away without pooling inside the mask. But the deliberate choice to make these functional vents look like the upturned corners of a snarl, ensuring that even the opening for breath looked like an expression of rage, was the work of craftsmen who understood that battle was as much psychological as physical. The complete armor, when assembled on its stand in the tokonoma display alcove of a great house, was breathtaking. It occupied space the way a presence occupied space, not simply as an object, but as a statement, as an embodiment of values, as something that carried the weight of the tradition it represented. Visitors to the house would pause before it. They would study it. They would understand, from its quality and its condition and the care with which it was displayed, something important about the family who owned it. The armor was not retired when a samurai died. It was inherited, passed from father to son, from master to trusted retainer, across generations, each new bearer responsible for its maintenance, for its repair, for the continuation of the relationship between the armor and the family whose honor it had protected. Some of the great armors of Japan carry the dents and scratches of battles fought 500 years ago. They were repaired, they were relacquered, they were loved, and they are still beautiful. Zen and the art of everything. Buddhism arrived in Japan from China and Korea in the 6th century. Over the following centuries, it transformed Japanese culture as profoundly as any political event or military campaign. It merged with Shinto in ways that were sometimes contradictory and always interesting, creating a spiritual landscape unlike any other in the world. A country where you could attend a Shinto ceremony in the morning and a Buddhist service in the evening and feel no contradiction, because both were simply different aspects of the same deep attention to the world. But of all the forms of Buddhism that took root in Japan, none shaped the culture more profoundly than Zen. Zen is, in some ways, the most radical form of Buddhism. It strips away almost everything: doctrine, scripture, elaborate ritual, theological complexity, and returns to a single urgent question. What is the nature of reality, and how can you experience it directly, without the interference of language and concept and the endless commentary of the thinking mind? The answer Zen gives is deceptively simple. Stop thinking about it. Look at it. The primary practice of Zen is Zazen, sitting meditation. You sit cross-legged in a posture that is neither tense nor collapsed, and you simply watch what happens in your mind. You don't try to stop thinking. You don't try to achieve any particular state. You simply observe the stream of thought and sensation passing through you with the same quality of attention you might give to a river. Present, aware, not trying to redirect the current. Over time, and it took years, decades, for many practitioners, The constant commentary of the thinking mind began to quiet. Not permanently, not completely, but enough that in certain moments the gap between the person and the thing they were looking at became very small. A flower was simply a flower. Rain on a roof was simply rain on a roof. And in that simplicity, there was something that the Zen masters described as satori, a sudden clarity, a direct experience of the nature of things without the filter of interpretation. The samurai found in Zen something they recognized, the state of mind Zen cultivated, the alert, present, unencumbered awareness that neither clung to what was pleasant nor recoiled from what was unpleasant, was exactly the state of mind a warrior needed in battle. In the moment of combat, there was no time for thought. There was only action, and the quality of that action depended entirely on the quality of the awareness behind it. The Japanese word for this state was mushin, no mind, not the absence of awareness, but the absence of self-consciousness. The mind functioning with perfect clarity and perfect responsiveness, like a mirror reflecting whatever was in front of it without distortion. The master swordsman in a state of mushin did not decide to respond to his opponent's attack. He simply responded. The body trained so thoroughly, the awareness so clear, that the correct action arose spontaneously, without hesitation and without error. But Zen did not only shape the samurai, it shaped everything. The tea ceremony, chado, the way of tea, was a Zen practice as much as a social ritual. The rock garden, karisansati, was a Zen meditation in stone and gravel. The art of flower arranging, ikebana, was a Zen practice. The art of archery, kyudo, was a Zen practice. Calligraphy, shodo, was a Zen practice. In each case, the principle was the same: total presence, complete attention, the dissolution of the gap between the practitioner and the practice. The tea ceremony deserves particular attention. Chado was developed in its classical form by the tea master Sen no Rikyu in the 16th century, and it remains one of the most extraordinary examples of philosophy made physical that any culture has ever produced. The tea room, chashitsu, was deliberately small, just large enough for a few people sitting in intimate proximity. The entrance, nijiriguchi, was so low that everyone, regardless of rank or status, had to bow deeply to enter. A general and his servants entered the same way. A lord and a peasant entered the same way. Inside the tea room there was no hierarchy. The ceremony itself was a series of precise, deliberate movements. The folding of the cloth, the rinsing of the bowl, the scooping of the tea, the whisking, the pouring. Each one performed with absolute attention. Each one an end in itself rather than merely a means to the end of drinking tea. The principle that governed everything was ichi go ichi-e. This moment, this meeting, only this, and never again exactly this. Every tea ceremony was understood to be unique. This particular combination of people, this light, this season, this bowl, this silence, it would never occur again. And therefore, it deserved to be fully inhabited, fully present, fully received. It was the philosophy of the haiku, expressed in bowls and water and the slow fold of a cloth. The ninja, masters of stillness and shadow. In the popular imagination of the West, the ninja is a figure of spectacular action, black-clad, acrobatic, spectacular in violence. The reality was considerably more interesting. The true shinobi, to use the original Japanese term, was above all a practitioner of invisibility, not the theatrical invisibility of disappearing in a puff of smoke, but the far more sophisticated invisibility of someone who understood how attention worked and had learned to operate in the spaces it didn't reach. The shinobi arts, ninjutsu, were developed primarily in the mountain provinces of Iga and Koga, regions so rugged and isolated that they developed their own distinctive martial and espionage traditions outside the formal structures of samurai society. The shinobi were the intelligence-gathering arm of warfare, the spies, the infiltrators, the agents who move through enemy territory, gathering information, creating confusion, or removing specific individuals with minimal noise and maximum effect. To do this required not spectacular violence but extraordinary patience and extraordinarily refined powers of observation. A shinobi might spend weeks in a location before taking any action, observing patterns of movement, learning the rhythms of a household, identifying the exact moment when attention would be elsewhere. They became students of human behavior in the same way that Zen masters became students of the human mind, with deep patience, complete presence, and total attention. They were also masters of disguise. The 7 disguises of the shinobi were not ninja costumes, but entirely ordinary social roles. A traveling monk, a merchant, a musician, a beggar, a craftsman, a performer, a mountain ascetic. In any of these guises, a trained shinobi could move through any level of society, gathering intelligence and passing entirely unnoticed. The most important weapon in the shinobi arsenal was not the shuriken throwing star or the short sword. It was stillness, the ability to be completely motionless, in a garden, in a corridor, in the shadows of a room, for as long as necessary, to breathe so quietly that the sound disappeared, to be present without registering as a presence. This was the highest skill, and it required the same quality of trained awareness that Zen meditation produced. The complete settling of the self into the present moment, the absence of the fidgeting self-conscious restlessness that made most people impossible to conceal. A fully trained shinobi was not invisible because of technology or magic. They were invisible because they had learned to be absolutely, completely still. And in that stillness, they disappeared. The geisha, the living art. To understand what a geisha was and is, for the tradition continues today, you must first set aside almost everything that popular culture has suggested about them. A geisha was not a courtesan. She was not a concubine. She was not available for purchase in any sense. A geisha was an artist. The word itself means simply a person of art. And the art a geisha practiced was not a single thing, but a complex constellation of disciplines, each one requiring years of dedicated training, each one contributing to the creation of something that had no precise equivalent in any other culture. A human being who'd been trained with extraordinary thoroughness and care to create the perfect atmosphere of beauty, grace, and cultivated conversation. Girls who entered the geisha world, usually in their early teens, often from families with long geisha connections, began as maiko, apprentice geisha, learning their craft in the formal geisha districts of Kyoto and other cities. For years, sometimes many years, they learn. They learn to play the shamisen, the three-stringed instrument whose sound is one of the most distinctive and beautiful in Japanese music, a sound somewhere between a lute and a banjo, capable of extraordinary emotional range. They learn to play the koto, the long zither with 13 strings that could fill a room with sound like water moving over stone. They learn the taiko drum, the shakuhachi flute, and the art of classical Japanese singing. They learn to dance. Japanese classical dance was nothing like what that phrase might suggest to a Western audience. It was slow, formal, almost impossibly precise. A system of movement so refined that the angle of a wrist, the direction of a gaze, the exact position of a fan could communicate entire emotional landscapes. A geisha performance was not entertainment in the casual sense. It was the presentation of something that had been perfected through years of work, a living demonstration of mastery so complete that the effort had disappeared and only the art remained. They learned the tea ceremony. They learned the art of conversation, specifically the art of conversation that made the person they were speaking with feel interesting, intelligent, and at ease. This was perhaps the most sophisticated skill of all. The geisha was not simply agreeable. She was genuinely, deeply, carefully attentive. She listened with the same quality of attention that a Zen master brought to meditation. She asked questions that opened rather than closed. She created a conversational atmosphere in which guests felt that the room, the evening, the entire occasion had been arranged specifically for their comfort and pleasure. because it had. The ozashiki, the geisha banquet, was the setting for this art. A traditional room in a Kyoto tea house. Tatami floors, sliding paper screens, the sound of rain or garden water just audible beyond the walls. Low lacquered tables, the particular quality of candlelight on silk. The geisha entered such a room the way a painting enters a wall, completing it, giving it its meaning. Her kimono was chosen for the season, for the occasion, for the hour of the evening. Her obi sash, the broad band of silk wound around the kimono at the waist, was tied in an elaborate knot whose style communicated to every knowledgeable observer exactly who and what she was. Her face was powdered white, her lips painted in a precise bow of red or pink, her hair arranged with the help of ornaments chosen with the same care given to every other element of her appearance. She moved through the room as though movement itself were a form of music. The sound of her feet on the floor was deliberate. The arrangement of her hands when she sat was deliberate. The angle at which she held her fan was deliberate. Everything was considered. Nothing was arbitrary. And yet none of it felt studied or effortful. The years of training had dissolved the effort completely. What remained was simply this person in this room, creating an atmosphere of extraordinary beauty by the quality of her presence alone. The white makeup of the geisha had a practical origin. In the days before electric light, candlelight caught and illuminated white better than any skin tone, making the geisha's face and neck visible and luminous across a dimly lit room. But over time, it became something more than practical. It became the mask that allowed the artist to be fully present while remaining, in some fundamental sense, apart. Behind the white face, the geisha was simultaneously fully present and completely protected. An artist inhabiting a role so thoroughly practiced it had become, over years, genuinely hers. The geisha tradition continues today in the Gion district of Kyoto, where the cobblestone streets and the wooden ochaya tea houses have changed very little in 2 centuries. On certain evenings, if you are in the right place at the right time, you might glimpse a geisha moving through the dusk, her lantern reflecting in a puddle on the ancient stones, her kimono a moving artwork, her footsteps soft and deliberate. She would be gone before you fully registered what you had seen, like the most beautiful things. The kimono, a philosophy in silk. The kimono is one of the most extraordinary garments ever made by human hands, not simply as clothing, though as clothing it is extraordinarily beautiful, but as a system of communication, as an aesthetic philosophy made wearable, as the expression of an entire civilization's relationship with beauty, with nature, and with time. The word kimono means simply thing to wear. But what is worn and how it is worn communicates with a precision and a complexity that would take years to fully learn to read. Begin with the fabric. Japanese silk, particularly the silk woven in the region around Kyoto, is unlike silk produced anywhere else in the world. Centuries of refinement have produced techniques of weaving so sophisticated that the resulting fabric seems to contain its own light, as though the thread itself were slightly luminous. Nishijiki silk brocade, woven in Kyoto for over 1200 years, is heavy with pattern and color, but somehow also light, stiff enough to hold its shape, fluid enough to move with the body, its patterns emerging and receding as the fabric shifts. The dyeing techniques applied to kimono silk are themselves art forms. Yuzen dyeing, developed in Kyoto in the 17th century, is essentially painting on fabric using rice paste to resist the dye and build up patterns of extraordinary intricacy and color. A single Yuzen kimono might take months to complete, its pattern designed to wrap around the body in a particular way, to reveal and conceal as the wearer moved, to present different compositions depending on whether the wearer was standing, seated, or in motion. Shibori, a form of tie-dyeing so refined it bore almost no resemblance to its Western counterpart, produced patterns of geometric precision and organic beauty that no printing technique could replicate. Each shibori kimono was unique, its pattern determined by the specific way the fabric had been folded, bound, twisted, and immersed. The choice of kimono communicated season above everything else. Cherry blossom patterns were worn in spring, before the cherry trees bloomed. Anticipation, not commemoration. Pine and bamboo for winter, chrysanthemum for autumn. Summer kimono were made of lighter fabrics, yukata cotton, rose silk gauze, in cooler colors, blues and whites and pale greens. To wear the wrong season's pattern was not simply a fashion error. It was a failure of attention, an inability to read where you were in the turning of the year. Age communicated through color and sleeve length. Young women, especially young unmarried women, wore the furisode, a long-sleeve kimono, its sleeves reaching almost to the ground, in vivid colors. As women aged, the sleeves shortened, the colors quietened. An older woman's kimono might be almost entirely one color, gray or deep blue, or a soft persimmon, its beauty residing entirely in the quality of the fabric and the perfection of its cut. The obi sash, the broad band of silk, sometimes 30 centimeters wide and 4 meters long, wrapped and folded around the waist and tied in an elaborate knot at the back, was itself a garment of extraordinary complexity. Different knot styles communicated different things. Different fabrics, patterns, and colors worked with or against the kimono beneath them. The art of tying an obi correctly was studied for years. To dress in a kimono properly was to spend an hour in preparation. Each layer was put on in a specific order. The thin under kimono first, its collar visible at the neck. Then the kimono itself, overlapped left side over right, never right over left, which was reserved for the dead. Then the koshi himo cords to hold the layers in place. Then the dateijime band to smooth the shape. Then the obi, wrapped and arranged and folded into its final knot with the help of a trained dresser or a patient family member. By the time the process was complete, the wearer had been wrapped in silk as carefully as a letter is wrapped in the most important envelope of their life. And the way they moved was changed by what they wore. The kimono required small steps and upright posture. It required awareness of how the sleeves moved, of how the hem fell, of the angle of the body when bowing. It slowed the wearer down, gently, inevitably, the way the approach to a Shinto shrine slowed the pilgrim, and in slowing them, brought them into a more conscious relationship with their own movement, their own presence, the specific moment they were inhabiting. To wear a kimono was to be reminded continuously of where you were, of what season held you, of the particular beauty of this particular day. Japanese tattoos, the art beneath the skin. The history of tattooing in Japan stretches back at least 5,000 years. Clay figurines from the Jomon period, some of the oldest human artifacts ever found in Japan, bear markings on their faces and bodies that archaeologists believe represent tattoos. These earliest marks were not decorative in any simple sense. They were spiritual, they were protective, they were the visible expression of an invisible relationship between the person who bore them and the forces, natural, supernatural, divine, that governed the world they lived in. This is where Japanese tattooing began, not in rebellion, not in the margins of society, but at the very center of it, in the spiritual practices of a people who understood that the body was not simply a physical object, but a living surface on which meaning could be written, carried, and made permanent. The word for tattoo in Japanese, irizumi, means literally to insert ink, but the tradition it named was far more than this simple description suggested. It was, at its height, one of the most technically accomplished and visually ambitious art forms ever practiced on the human body. The Ainu people of Hokkaido, the indigenous people of Japan's northernmost island, practiced tattooing as a sacred tradition for thousands of years. Ainu women received tattoos around their mouths, broad, dark markings that began in childhood and were added to throughout adolescence, reaching their final form by the time the woman was considered ready for marriage. These were not decorations. They were marks of identity, of status, of spiritual protection. The mouth was considered a particularly important threshold, the place where the inner world communicated with the outer, where breath and speech and nourishment all crossed the boundary of the body. To mark it was to consecrate it, to acknowledge its significance, to announce the woman's readiness to take her place in the adult world. The tools of early Japanese tattooing were bone needles and natural inks, soot and plant-derived pigments introduced beneath the skin by tapping or puncturing in methods that would be recognizable to traditional tattoo practitioners in cultures across the Pacific, from Polynesia to the Americas, suggesting a deep and ancient human impulse that transcended any single culture's invention. In the Kofun period, the era of the great burial mounds, roughly the 3rd to 7th centuries, tattooing appears in the historical record in a different context. The chronicles describe criminals being tattooed on the face or the arms as punishment and public marking, a practice that would persist in various forms for centuries. This punitive use of tattooing created a lasting association between body marking and the criminal class that would shape Japanese attitudes toward tattoos in complex ways for the next 1,000 years. But even as the state used tattooing as punishment, the ordinary people, and particularly the people whose lives were built around physical labor and danger, were developing their own tattooing traditions with entirely different meanings. The fishermen of the coastal communities tattooed themselves for spiritual protection. A fisherman who spent his life on open water, at the mercy of weather and tide and the vast indifference of the sea, needed whatever protection he could find. The tattoos on his arms and chest were prayers made permanent, images of the gods and creatures he trusted to keep him safe, worn on his body so that no storm could separate him from his protections, no distance from shore could put them beyond reach. The tattoo was armor of a kind that no sword could cut and no wave could wash away. The great flowering of Japanese tattooing as a visual art form came in the Edo period, the same long era of relative peace and extraordinary cultural productivity that gave the world ukiyo-e woodblock prints, kabuki theater, the haiku of Matsuo Basho. It was not a coincidence. The same cultural ferment that was producing extraordinary art on paper and wood and silk was also producing extraordinary art on skin. The connection was literal. The great ukiyo-e woodblock print artists of the Edo period, the masters of bold outline, vivid color, and dramatic composition, were the visual inspiration for the new style of tattooing that emerged in Edo in the late 18th century. Tattoo artists, Horishi, began applying the same aesthetic principles to the human body that the printmakers were applying to paper. Bold black outlines, areas of solid color, dramatic compositions that use the curves and contours of the body the way a landscape artist used the contours of a hillside, not fighting them but following them, letting the movement of the design emerge from the movement of the body it adorned. The subjects were the subjects of ukiyo-e, mythological creatures and legendary heroes, scenes from literature and folklore, the natural world rendered with the same vivid specificity that Hokusai brought to Mount Fuji and the Great Wave. The dragon. No creature was more central to Japanese tattoo art than the dragon, Ryu, and no creature was further from the Western dragon of fire and malevolence. The Japanese dragon was a water creature associated with rivers, seas, rain, and the beneficial forces of water that brought life to the rice paddies and the cities. It was a creature of wisdom and protection, its coiling form suggesting not threat but power held in reserve, immense capability at rest, available when needed. A dragon tattoo in the Japanese tradition was not a statement of danger. It was a statement of protection, of the wearer placing themselves under the guardianship of one of the most powerful, benevolent forces in the Japanese spirit world. The dragon's body was designed to coil around the contours of the arm or the torso, its scales rendered in exquisite detail, each one a small masterpiece of the tattoo needle, its claws and teeth and the flowing whiskers around its face communicating power and grace simultaneously. The clouds that surrounded it, always clouds, the natural element of a creature that moved between heaven and earth, were rendered in the same swirling forms that appeared in the great paintings of the period. The koi fish, Nishiki-goi, carried one of the most beloved stories in Japanese tattoo tradition. The legend told of a school of koi swimming upstream against a powerful current, a journey of extraordinary difficulty and duration. Most fish turned back, but a single koi persisted, swimming against the current for 100 years until it reached the Dragon Gate waterfall, the most difficult point of the entire journey. It leapt the waterfall and was transformed by the gods, in recognition of its perseverance, into a dragon. The koi tattoo was a symbol of perseverance, of the willingness to continue against difficulty, of the belief that extraordinary effort would eventually be rewarded with extraordinary transformation. It was worn by people who understood what it meant to keep swimming when everything pushed back. The cherry blossom, sakura, appeared in tattooing with all the philosophical weight it carried in every other area of Japanese culture: beauty and impermanence, the full flowering and the inevitable fall. A cherry blossom tattoo was not simply a pretty image, it was a meditation on the nature of beauty itself, an acknowledgement that the most beautiful things were the most temporary, and that this was not a cause for grief but for presence, for full attention, for the particular quality of love that could only exist in the face of loss. The phoenix, who was the creature of renewal and rebirth, associated in Japanese tradition with virtue and grace, said to appear only in times of peace and prosperity, and to disappear in times of chaos. Unlike the Western phoenix consumed by fire and reborn from ashes, the Japanese Hu was a creature of gentle power, its body combining elements of multiple birds into a single being of extraordinary beauty, its presence a blessing. The Raijin and Fujin, the gods of thunder and wind, appeared as fierce, dynamic figures in tattoo art. Their wild energy expressed through bold lines and dramatic movement. They were not beings to be feared, but forces to be acknowledged. The wild energy of storms as something that belonged to the world, that the body could contain and honor through the act of bearing their image. The peony, Botan, was considered the king of flowers in Japanese culture, associated with wealth, prosperity, and good fortune. In tattoo tradition, it carried additional meaning: the courage to face danger, the willingness to walk through fire without flinching. A peony tattoo was a statement about character. Tigers, powerful, solitary, fearless, were associated with courage and strength, and with the ability to repel evil spirits. Wave and water imagery connected the wearer to the power and the unpredictability of the ocean, and to the fisherman tradition from which so much of Japanese tattoo culture had grown. The Irizumi bodysuit, the full body tattoo, was the supreme expression of the tradition. A full bodysuit typically left the hands, feet, face, and a strip down the center of the torso uncovered, allowing the wearer to appear in clothing as an ordinary person. The entire artwork concealed beneath the fabric of daily life, revealed only in specific circumstances to specific people. Creating a full bodysuit was a project of years. The teburi technique, hand poking, using a wooden or metal tool fitted with needles and worked by hand rather than machine, was the traditional method, and it remained the preferred method of master horishi even as tattooing machines became available. Tebori produced a different quality of line than machine work, slightly softer, with a particular quality of ink saturation that many connoisseurs felt was more beautiful and more durable. A session with a traditional horishi was nothing like a modern tattoo appointment. You removed your street clothes and put on a simple garment that exposed the area being worked. You lay on a mat or sat on cushions in the traditional position. The horishi worked in silence or in quiet conversation. The rhythm of the tebori tool, a soft percussion in the stillness of the studio. There was no loud music, no casual chat, no appointment running over schedule. There was the work, the tool, the ink, the skin, and the slow accumulation of something that would last a lifetime. The relationship between the horishi and the client was understood as something significant, not merely commercial, but personal. A master horishi did not simply execute the client's wishes. He understood the client, their character, their history, their aspirations, and designed a composition that expressed something true about who they were. The design emerged from the relationship. This was why a full bodysuit from a master horishi was considered, in the Edo period and beyond, one of the most intimate and most personal forms of self-expression available to a human being. Not because it was visible, but because it was permanent. The Meiji period, beginning in 1868, when Japan opened to the West and began its extraordinary modernization brought a complicated turn in the history of Japanese tattooing. The new government, anxious to appear civilized in Western eyes and aware that Western visitors associated tattooing with primitiveness, banned tattooing entirely in 1872. The ban lasted until 1948. During those 76 years, tattooing moved underground. The horiishi continued to work in secret, passing their knowledge and their needles to students in the same way they always had. The bodysuit tradition continued. The art did not die. It simply became invisible, which was, in a sense, entirely consistent with the Japanese understanding of the most important things. The most significant things were often the ones that couldn't be seen. And when the ban was lifted after the Second World War, the tradition emerged again, changed by its years of concealment, carrying the complicated associations that the underground period had given it, but alive, still producing work of extraordinary beauty. Today, traditional Japanese tattooing, Nihon Erazumi, is recognized as one of the great art forms of human civilization. The masters who practice it in the old Tebari style are among the most sought-after artists in the world. The imagery, dragons and koi, phoenix and tiger, cherry blossom and peony and wave, has spread across the world and influenced tattoo traditions on every continent. But its heart remains where it began, in a quiet studio, in the rhythm of the tool, in the slow, permanent inscription of meaning on the living surface of a human body, an art older than the samurai, older than the tea ceremony, older, perhaps, than any tradition Japan produced. Still here, still speaking, art, calligraphy, and the making of ink and brush. To understand Japanese calligraphy, you must first understand what it was not. It was not handwriting. It was not the transcription of words onto paper. It was not a skill developed for the practical purpose of leaving a record. Shodo, the way of writing, was a spiritual discipline, a meditative practice, a form of art so demanding and so subtle that the greatest masters spent their entire lives in pursuit of a quality of mark-making that could only be achieved in moments of perfect stillness. A single brushstroke, one stroke, perhaps the stroke that formed the Japanese character for ki, for energy or spirit, could take years to learn to make correctly, not because the movement was mechanically difficult, but because the correct movement required the entire practitioner, body, mind, breath, attention, to be completely aligned and completely present in the moment of the stroke. Ink on paper was permanent. There was no correction, no going back. The stroke you made was the stroke you made. If your attention wavered for a fraction of a second, if a thought intruded, if anxiety tightened your hand, if self-consciousness interrupted the flow, the stroke would show it. The quality of the line was a direct record of the quality of the awareness behind it. A master calligrapher's work could be read by another master like a medical chart. This is a person who was fully present. This is a person who was performing rather than being. This is a person who hesitated here, who rushed there, who breathed at the wrong moment. The preparation for calligraphy was as important as the practice itself. The Suzuri inkstone was a flat stone of extraordinary smoothness, with a shallow well at one end to hold water. The calligrapher placed a small amount of water in this well, and then took the sumi inkstick, a compressed block of carbon black made from the soot of burning pine or oil, bound with hide glue and sometimes infused with camphor or musk, and ground it against the stone in slow circular movements. This process could not be rushed. The grinding of ink was considered part of the practice, the meditative preparation that settled the mind before the brush touched the paper. As the ink stick moved slowly across the stone, the water darkened, thickening gradually into ink of the correct consistency. The smell of the ink as it formed, mineral, slightly sweet, the particular smell of carbon and water, was itself part of the atmosphere of the practice. The ink stick itself was an object of art. The finest sumi ink sticks were made in a process stretching back over 2,000 years. Pine soot, gathered from the incomplete burning of pine wood in carefully controlled conditions, was collected and processed to remove impurities, then mixed with melted hide glue in specific proportions, kneaded by hand until it achieved the correct consistency, and pressed into carved wooden molds. The resulting sticks were then dried slowly for months, sometimes years, in specific humidity conditions. Old ink was considered better than new. An ink stick that had dried for a decade produced ink of greater depth and complexity than one freshly made, darker in the shadows, richer in the highlights, with a quality of surface that new ink couldn't match. Exceptional ink sticks were kept for generations, brought out for important works, considered treasures. The feud, the brush, was made with equal care. Different animals contributed different qualities. Deer hair, firm, springy, capable of producing a line of great precision. Rabbit hair, soft, absorbent, capable of great variation from thick to thin within a single stroke. Horse mane, strong and responsive. Weasel, the finest and most responsive of all, used for the most delicate work. The hair was gathered, selected strand by strand for consistency, bound in a precise bundle and attached to a handle of bamboo, sometimes lacquered, sometimes plain. The tip of the brush, the crucial element, was shaped to a perfect point, capable of producing a line so thin it was barely visible, or, with a shift of pressure and angle, a stroke as broad as the hand itself. The brush was a device of extraordinary range, and learning to use that range to move from the fine point to the full body of the brush and back again within a single stroke. Maintaining consistent pressure and consistent speed was the work of years. Japanese calligraphy and painting were closely related. The same brushes and inks, the same principles of presence and attention, the same understanding that the quality of the mark was inseparable from the quality of the mind that made it. The great masters of Japanese ink painting, sumi-e, could suggest an entire landscape in half a dozen strokes, a mountain in morning mist, 2 or 3 strokes of diluted ink on white paper, the edges soft and uncertain where the wash had spread. No outline, no detail, just the essential quality of a mountain as it emerged from fog, its weight, its altitude, its relationship to the sky above it and the valley below. Less was more, infinitely more. The white paper around the brushstroke was as important as the stroke itself. The empty space was not absence, but presence, breathing room, the silence between the notes, without which the notes themselves would be noise. Hokusai, born in Edo in 1760, changed his artist's name 30 times during his career, a practice that reflected his constant sense that he was still becoming, still learning, still reaching for something just beyond his grasp. He produced the 36 views of Mount Fuji in his 70s and the Great Wave, arguably the most recognized artwork ever created in Asia, in his early 70s. He said, at the age of 73, that he had learned nothing useful before the age of 50, and that by the time he was 80 he expected to have made real progress, and that by 110 he expected every dot and every stroke to be truly alive. He died at 89, still working. Wabi-sabi, Kintsugi, and the beauty of impermanence. Every culture develops a relationship with impermanence. Most cultures resist it. Japan, uniquely, built an entire aesthetic philosophy around embracing it. Wabi-sabi is the Japanese aesthetic of imperfect, incomplete, and impermanent beauty. The beauty of things that are old, weathered, asymmetrical, rough-edged, and fading. It is the opposite of the Western aesthetic of polish and perfection, where Western taste has historically valued the symmetrical, the complete, the new, the flawless. Wabi-sabi finds its deepest beauty in the cracked, the faded, the worn, and the irregular. The word wabi originally referred to the loneliness of living in nature, remote from society, a kind of austere, simple solitude. Over time, it came to mean the beauty found in simplicity and imperfection, the beauty of the plain and the modest, the beauty of a wooden bowl, its grain visible, its surface slightly rough to the touch, the beauty of a garden in late autumn, the leaves mostly fallen, the bare branches tracing their intricate patterns against a grey sky. Sabi referred to the beauty that came with age and use, the patina that developed on a bronze temple bell after centuries of weather, the worn smoothness of a stone step shaped by 10,000 feet, the particular quality of old silk that had softened and faded to colors no dye could deliberately produce. Together, wabi-sabi described a way of seeing, a way of looking at the world that found beauty not in its perfection but in its honesty, in the way things showed their age and their history and their use, in the way they bore the marks of having been genuinely lived with rather than simply displayed. The tea bowl is the supreme example of wabi-sabi aesthetics. A perfect tea bowl, smooth, symmetrical, flawlessly glazed, was considered by the great tea masters less interesting than an imperfect one. The bowl that had a slight irregularity in its shape, that showed the thumbprint of the potter in its clay, that had a glaze that ran unevenly or crackled in the firing. This was the more beautiful bowl, because it was more honest, because it bore evidence of its own making, because it was a specific thing rather than a generic ideal. Sen no Rikyu, the great tea master, famously preferred objects that were rough, simple, and irregular to those that were smooth and refined. He found more beauty in a clay bowl made by an ordinary craftsman than in a lacquered vessel of obvious perfection. He understood that the feeling of beauty came not from the object alone, but from the relationship between the object and the person receiving it, and that a perfect object left no room for that relationship, while an imperfect one opened a space for it. Kintsugi takes this philosophy to its most extraordinary conclusion. When a ceramic bowl or cup was broken, the Japanese practice of Kintsugi, golden joinery, repaired it with lacquer mixed with powdered gold, not hiding the break, celebrating it. The repaired bowl was considered more beautiful than the unbroken one, because the break was now part of its story. The history of the bowl, including the accident, the loss, the repair, the decision to continue, was visible in the gold lines that marked where it had broken and been made whole again. The damage was not erased, but honored. The bowl's vulnerability was not concealed, but acknowledged as a source of beauty. This idea that what has been broken and repaired is more beautiful than what has never been broken is perhaps the most radical and most compassionate aesthetic idea in human history. It applies to bowls. It also applies to everything else. The cherry blossom is the most beloved symbol of this philosophy. The Japanese call the appreciation of cherry blossoms hanami, flower viewing, and have celebrated it for over 1,000 years. What they are celebrating is not simply the beauty of the flowers, but their brevity. Cherry blossoms last perhaps 2 weeks, in some years, depending on the weather, even less. Their beauty is inseparable from their transience. They are beautiful precisely because they are falling, precisely because they are brief, precisely because you know, standing under the petals as they drift down around you, that this is already almost over. Mono no aware. The phrase is often translated as the sadness of things, but that's not quite right. Aware is not simple sadness. It is a complex emotional experience that includes sadness, but also tenderness, love, and something close to gratitude, the particular feeling of being fully alive to something beautiful in the knowledge that it will pass. Standing under the cherry blossoms in full bloom, watching the petals fall on the wind, knowing that in a week they will all be gone. This is mono no aware, and it is not, in the Japanese understanding, a painful experience. It is a complete one. To feel mono no aware was to be fully human. Mount Fuji, the sacred mountain. There is no other mountain like it. Mount Fuji stands alone in the landscape, rising from the flat Kanto plain to a height of 3,776 meters in a single, almost perfectly symmetrical cone. It is a volcano, one of the most beautiful and most spiritually significant in the world, and it has not erupted since 1707, though it is not considered extinct. From a distance, in clear weather, its snow-capped peak appears above the surrounding landscape like something from a different dimension entirely, too perfect, too symmetrical, too purely itself to be simply a mountain. It has the quality of something imagined before, something discovered. The Japanese have considered it sacred for at least 12 centuries. In Shinto belief, Mount Fuji was the dwelling place of the goddess Konohana Sakuya Hime, the princess who makes flowers bloom, whose name itself described the cherry blossom's brief, brilliant life. To climb Mount Fuji was an act of pilgrimage, the body ascending toward the divine through increasing cold and altitude, the world below receding and simplifying as the summit approached. The traditional pilgrim climbed at night, starting in the darkness of the early hours, making the ascent by lantern light, timing the climb to reach the summit at dawn. The experience of watching the sun rise from the summit of Mount Fuji, Goraiko, the arrival of light, was considered one of the most sacred experiences available to a person in this life. The sun rising above the clouds, the world spread below in every direction, the light arriving not from outside, but from within the fog itself, illuminating everything at once. Hokusai spent years making images of Mount Fuji, his 36 views, and ultimately the 100 views that followed, explored the mountain from every direction, in every season, in every light. Mount Fuji appearing above a calm harbor, Mount Fuji seen through a barrel being made by a craftsman, Mount Fuji reflected in a lake below a full moon, Mount Fuji framed by the hollow wave, the great wave that was about to swallow the boats in the foreground while the mountain in the far background remained perfectly, serenely unchanged. The Great Wave is perhaps the most analyzed artwork in Japanese history. The wave is enormous, violent, reaching. Its claw-like crest is about to break over the small fishing boat struggling in the foreground, and behind it, small but absolutely present, absolutely unchanged, Mount Fuji. The transient world, wave, boat, human struggle against the permanent. the mountain unchanged by the wave, just as it was unchanged by the centuries. The message was not that the mountain was more important than the wave, it was that both were true simultaneously. The impermanence and the permanence, the struggle and the stillness, the wave and the mountain, both real, both present, both worthy of complete attention. No, Kabuki and the theater of dreams, Japan produced two theatrical traditions so unlike anything else in the world that they require new categories of understanding. No theater was developed in the 14th century by the playwright and actor Zeami Motokyo, who remains one of the most profound theatrical thinkers in history. Zeami understood that the most powerful theatrical moments were not those of greatest action or greatest emotion, but those of greatest stillness, the moment before the action, the space between the emotions, the pause in which the audience's imagination was engaged so completely that what they imagined was more powerful than anything the stage could show. He called this quality yugen, a profound, mysterious beauty, a grace that went beyond the merely visible, a beauty that suggested depths that could be felt but not fully expressed. No performances were slow, extraordinarily slow, by any normal theatrical standard. A single play might last several hours, its action advancing in increments so gradual that the audience had to enter a different relationship with time, had to stop expecting things to happen and start simply being present in whatever was happening, however small. The actors wore masks, the famous no masks, carved from cypress wood, with an expression that seemed to change as the angle of light changed. The same mask could appear serene or anguished depending on how the actor tilted his head. The entire art of no acting consisted of these minute adjustments: the precise angle of a fan, the exact placement of a foot, the quality of stillness between movements. The most powerful moment in no was called ma, the pause, the meaningful silence, the empty space through which meaning moved. The audience sat in complete silence during a ma, not the restless silence of an audience waiting for something to happen, but the deep silence of people who understood that something was already happening, that the pause was the performance, that the empty space was full. Kabuki theater was in many ways the opposite of no. Where no was spare, Kabuki was spectacular. Where no was slow, Kabuki was vivid. Where no cultivated stillness, Kabuki celebrated the extraordinary gesture, the mai, the dramatic freeze, where the actor held a pose of intense emotion at a peak moment while the audience responded with shouts of appreciation. Kabuki developed in the early 17th century as a popular theatrical form. Loud, colorful, accessible, full of exciting plots and extraordinary costumes. But it developed its own forms of sophistication alongside its spectacular surface. The onagata actors, men who played female roles, developed a stylized, femininity of such precision and beauty that many audiences found their portrayal more moving than the performance of women could have been. The stylization itself created a kind of double consciousness. You knew it was a man, and the knowing made the beauty of the illusion more complex, more interesting, more affecting. Both No and Kabuki understood something that Western theatre often forgot. That theatre was not the imitation of life, it was the distillation of it. A night in Edo. It is the 18th century, and the Edo, the city that would become Tokyo, is perhaps the most populous city in the world. 1 million people, perhaps more. Nobody is entirely certain. But the city that fills the broad, flat plain of the Kanto region, bounded by the sea on one side and the mountains on the other, is vast and dense and alive in a way that few places on earth have ever been. And on this particular evening, as the sun moves toward the mountains and the light shifts from gold to copper to the deep blue of early dusk, the city is settling into night. The great lanterns are being lit. In the shop fronts along the main streets, the merchants selling silk, the merchants selling lacquerware, the booksellers and the print sellers and the sword polishers and the purveyors of 500 kinds of food. Paper lanterns are appearing in doorways, their warm light spilling out onto the street where it mixes with the fading daylight. Along the canals, the canal boats are returning with the last loads of the day. Rice, timber, charcoal, fish from the morning catch that has been to market and been mostly sold. The unsold remainder going to the canal-side food stalls that were beginning to cook their evening trade. The smell of cooking drifted across the city. Yakitori over charcoal, chicken threaded on bamboo skewers, brushed with sweet soy, the fat dripping and the smoke rising in thin columns above the stalls. Soba noodles in clear dashi broth, the buckwheat noodles grey-brown and slightly rough, served with a curl of fresh spring onion and a sprinkle of sesame. Tempura, the batter so light and so precisely calibrated that it was barely there, barely a coating, a whisper of crispness round the prawn inside. The streets were crowded but unhurried, the merchants and their families living above their shops, the craftsmen returning from their workshops, carrying their tools wrapped in cloth, the samurai moving through the streets with the particular unhurried authority of people who were accustomed to space being made for them. The monks from the temple on the hill, their robes moving around them in the evening breeze. Children ran. Somewhere, from a tea house several streets away, came the sound of a shamisen, three-stringed and precise, its music finding its way between the buildings and along the canals, arriving faintly where you least expected it, mixing briefly with the sound of the evening bell from the local temple, before both sounds dissolved into the larger sound of the city settling down. In the pleasure districts, the ukiyo, the floating world, the evening was just beginning. The tea houses were lighting their lanterns. The geisha were beginning their elaborate preparations. The kabuki theater was filling, the audience finding their places among the smell of food and the excited murmur of people prepared to be transported somewhere extraordinary for the next several hours. In a small house on a quiet street near the edge of the city, a man sat at his writing desk. He was a poet, not a famous one, not yet, but one who had been writing with growing confidence for several years, whose verses were beginning to circulate in the literary circles of the city, who occasionally received a note from someone he admired, saying that they had read such and such a poem and found it moved them. He uncapped his inkstone and began to grind. Outside, the evening settled. The lanterns of the city stretched away in every direction as far as he could see from his small window. 10,000 points of warm light in the darkening blue, like fireflies that had decided to stay. He watched them for a long moment. Then he picked up his brush. Gardens, silence, and the philosophy of Ma. The Japanese garden is not a garden in any sense that the word usually carries. It is not a place where flowers are grown for their beauty. It is not a domesticated patch of nature. It is not an outdoor extension of the living space, furnished with plants the way a room is furnished with chairs. The Japanese garden is a philosophy made visible, a meditation on space, time, and the nature of beauty, expressed through the arrangement of stones, water, moss, gravel, and carefully shaped plants in combinations that have been refined over 1,000 years. There are several distinct traditions: the karasansui, the dry garden, or rock garden, is perhaps the most famous to Western eyes. The great example is Ryoanji in Kyoto, a garden of 15 stones arranged in raked white gravel in a roughly rectangular space, perhaps the size of a large room. There are no flowers, there is no water, there is no soft planting of any kind, just stone and gravel and the particular quality of attention that the garden demands. The 15 stones of Ryoanji are arranged in 5 groups: 2, 3, 2, 5, and 3 stones, in a composition that is neither symmetrical nor obviously random. It has the quality of a sentence in a language you almost understand. There is clearly meaning here, clearly intention, but the specific meaning resists being pinned down and explained. No matter where you sit to view the garden, you cannot see all 15 stones at once. One is always hidden. This was intentional. In Zen philosophy, the part that could not be perceived, the hidden stone, the sound in the silence, the meaning between the words, was as important as what was visible. The empty space in the garden was not absence. It was Ma, the meaningful pause, the necessary emptiness, without which everything else would be noise. The concept of Ma runs through all Japanese art and design. In music, the silence between the notes, in painting, the blank paper around the brushstroke. In architecture, the empty room that gives the furnished room its meaning. In conversation, the pause that allows what has just been said to actually land. Ma was not nothing. It was everything. The stroll garden, the Kaiushiki garden, found in the great estates of the Edo period, was a different kind of experience. Walking gardens designed around a central pond, with carefully planned views that revealed themselves gradually as the walker moved along prescribed paths. Each turn of the path framed a new composition. A bridge reflected in still water, a stone lantern glimpsed through bamboo, a borrowed view of a distant mountain that appeared to belong to the garden while actually being miles away. The garden was designed as a series of emotional experiences, each one distinct, each one preparing the walker for the next. The whole sequence building to a cumulative quality of peace that settled into the body as thoroughly as sleep. These gardens understood something important about human consciousness, that we cannot receive beauty while we are hurrying, that the quality of attention required to genuinely experience a stone garden or a borrowed mountain view was not the attention of daily life, the quick assessment, the immediate understanding, the restless movement to the next thing. It was the attention of deep presence, of someone who had stopped trying to get anywhere and was simply, fully here. The gardens created the conditions for that kind of attention. And in those conditions, ordinary things, light on water, the sound of wind in bamboo, the specific grey-green of old moss on stone, became extraordinary. The art of the miniature world, bonsai. There is a bonsai tree in a Japanese temple that is over 500 years old. It was alive during the age of the great samurai. It was alive when Shakespeare was writing. It has been tended by perhaps 40 generations of hands, each one learning from the last how to water it, how to prune it, how to wire its branches into their specific and deliberate shapes, how to read what it needed and respond with patience. It is a juniper. It stands perhaps 60 centimeters tall, and it is considered one of the great treasures of Japanese culture. Bonsai. The word means simply planted in a container, is one of the most misunderstood art forms in the world. In the West, it is often thought of as the miniaturization of trees, a clever horticultural trick, a novelty. In Japan, it is something else entirely. It is the cultivation of a relationship between a human being and a living thing that unfolds across decades, sometimes centuries, and demands from the practitioner a quality of patience and attention that has no equivalent in almost any other art form. A bonsai tree is not a small tree. It is a full-size tree, expressed in miniature. Every proportion correct, every characteristic of the species faithfully present. The bark as furrowed as it would be on a forest giant. The dead wood as bleached and weathered as a tree that has survived 1,000 storms. The nabari, the surface roots spreading from the base, as dramatic and as powerful as the roots of a tree 50 times its size. Achieving this required not weeks of work, but years, sometimes decades. The art of bonsai involved every element of the tree's environment: the soil, the pot, the watering, the feeding, the pruning of roots and branches, the wiring of branches to guide their growth in specific directions over months and years, the management of sunlight and shade, and the specific microclimate of the display space. Every decision affected the tree's development, and the effects of decisions made today would not be fully visible for 5 or 10 years. This was the central discipline of bonsai, learning to act in the present for consequences you would not see for years. Learning to care for something whose full beauty was always still ahead of you, always in the process of becoming. The great bonsai masters spoke of the tree as a partner rather than a subject. You did not impose your vision on the tree. You learned what the tree wanted to become and helped it become that. You studied it in every season, learned its specific rhythms and responses, understood its character, because every bonsai had character. Every bonsai was a particular and specific living thing rather than a generic example of its species. The pot was chosen with as much care as the tree. The relationship between the tree and the pot, the way the color and texture of the clay either complemented or competed with the character of the tree, was itself a study. A rough, ancient-looking pine needed an unglazed, earthy pot. A delicate maple in autumn color might be placed in a pot of pale celadon that echoed the cool morning sky. The display of a bonsai in the tokonoma, the alcove in a traditional Japanese room where objects of beauty were presented, was arranged as carefully as any painting. The tree, the pot, the surface it rested on, the scroll hung behind it, the single accompanying object beside it, perhaps a small stone or a tiny figurine, all composed into a single, complete aesthetic statement. Viewing a bonsai was not a quick experience. You sat with it. You looked at it the way you looked at a great painting, not assessing it, not cataloguing it, but receiving it. The specific line of the trunk, the way one branch reached and another descended, the aged texture of the bark, the particular quality of stillness in the arrangement, living stillness, the stillness of something that was growing imperceptibly even as you watched. In that stillness was the same quality that the rock garden contained, that the tea ceremony contained, that the haiku contained, the entire world, held in a small space, completely present, completely itself. And if you sat with it long enough, if you gave it the quality of attention it asked for, the bonsai gave something back, not information, not entertainment, something quieter than either, the particular piece of a thing that has been growing patiently in the same direction for a very long time, tended by hands that are now gone, waiting for the hands that will tend it next, a living thread connecting the past to the present to the future. In a pot no larger than a pair of cupped hands, the last light, Japan, moving toward night. The sun is moving toward the mountains. In the rice paddies of the valleys, the water between the young green shoots has turned from silver to gold. The herons, that have been standing in the shallows since early morning are making their slow, unhurried departures, lifting on broad grey wings, crossing the last of the afternoon light, disappearing into the tree line one by one. On the slopes of the mountains, the cedar forests have gone dark, their canopies holding the day's last light only at the very top where individual branches catch the sun. Somewhere in those trees, a wood pigeon is calling, 4 notes, repeated, the sound carrying clearly across the valley in the particular quiet that arrives before true dark. In Kyoto, the temple bells are beginning. Not all at once, one then another, each bell with its own voice, its own particular weight of tone, carrying across the city the way water carries across still air. The great bell of Chion-in Temple, the largest temple bell in Japan, rings with a sound so deep and so sustained that it seems less like sound than like weather, something the body feels rather than merely hears. 108 rings of the great bell, 108 for the 108 earthly desires that Buddhism teaches are the sources of human suffering. With each ring, one desire released. By the last ring, the year, or the day, or the moment has been cleared, like water clearing after the last ripple has subsided. In the Zen temple gardens, the monks are raking the gravel for the last time. The long-handled rakes move through the white stone in slow, even strokes, leaving parallel lines of extraordinary straightness that will be perfect until the wind disturbs them, or until the monks return tomorrow morning to rake them again. The act of raking was itself a meditation, its repetition a form of prayer, its perfection temporary by design. Nothing was meant to last forever. Everything was meant to be done with complete attention while it was being done. In the old capital, the lanterns of the Geisha districts are coming on, one by one, their paper glow warming the cobblestone streets that have been walked by extraordinary people for 300 years. The sound of a shamisen reaches the street briefly and fades. On the slopes of Mount Fuji, the last climbers of the day are making their descent as the first night climbers, those who have timed their ascent to reach the summit at dawn, are beginning their upward journey, their lanterns small and determined points of light moving slowly up the dark mountain. And somewhere in the mountains of a province that had many names over many centuries, in a small wooden temple that has been rebuilt in exactly the same form on the same spot for 1200 years, a monk is sitting in meditation. He has been sitting since before the sun went down. He will sit until the stars have completed a certain arc across the sky. His breathing is so slow and so quiet that it is barely perceptible. His body is perfectly still. His eyes are half open, resting on the middle distance the way Zen tradition prescribed. Not looking at anything, not looking away from anything, simply present. The night settles around him. The temple wood creaks once as the temperature falls. An owl sounds from the forest below. The stars emerge one by one from the deepening sky, and the Milky Way, so clear out here, away from any city light, begins its slow rotation above the mountain. He breathes in, he breathes out. The night continues. Japan breathes around him, all of it, all of its centuries and all of its beauty, all of its philosophy and all of its art, all of its mountains and all of its gardens and all of its ink ground slowly on stone in the particular silence of early morning, all of it present in this moment, in this breath, in this small wooden temple on the side of this mountain, in this monk sitting with complete stillness in the dark. Breathe in and out. The cherry blossoms have fallen. The ink has dried on 1,000 scrolls. The great bell has sounded its last note, and the sound is still traveling outward through the night air, growing quieter and quieter, but never quite reaching silence. Let your body become still now, very still. Your hands, wherever they rest, are warm and heavy. Your breathing is slow. Your eyes, behind their lids, have stopped searching. There is nowhere to go. There is nothing to do. Only this breath and this one, and the last light leaving the sky above Japan as it has left every evening for 10,000 years, the mountains dark against the stars, the lanterns lit, the water in the temple garden absolutely still. And if you find yourself in that soft space between waking and dreaming, standing somewhere that smells of cedar and incense and rain, on old stone, follow the lantern light. It will take you somewhere beautiful. It always does. Good night. From Dreamy Night Facts, the gentle learning channel, where history becomes rest, and rest becomes something you carry with you. Always. Sleep now. Good night.